So now, having fought the Korean War, we can try and talk about how South Korea is going to develop and also the United States' role in that development. Now, one thing that's shocking, if you look at the GDP per capita in South Korea in 1950, before the war began, so this is before the devastation of the war, before we lost all those people, South Korea had a GDP of $876 per capita. The United States had more than 10 times that amount. So this is really striking, the amount of poverty that there was, and it was even greater after the Korean War. And the the Republic of Korea, South Korea, is one of the poorest countries in the world at this time, right? And especially poor after the devastation of the Korean War. So it's really amazing how it developed and just how wealthy it is today. And that is something that the United States played an important role in that development. And things were not looking good initially. There were a lot of problems in South Korea. First of all, they had to rebuild just to get caught up with what they had before, right? So remember, Korea, before it was annexed by Japan, was an extraordinarily poor country. While it was annexed by Japan, while it's true that some modernity did come in, remember that was colonial modernity, Koreans were often excluded, particularly from leadership positions. What education there was typically meant to keep Koreans in subordinate positions. So they weren't doing all that well before. And it's not a question of simply economic development at first. It's just a question of how do we get to what we were before World War II started. And we weren't even doing that well to begin with then. So you got to think about this. Korea not only has to recover, it was behind to begin with. And another big problem is North Korea had invaded the Republic of Korea. Would they do it again? There's a good chance they would if they thought that would actually succeed in uniting the peninsula. So South Korea had to make sure that it put a lot of money and a lot of effort into its national defense. And in fact, the army was one of the most modern, advanced parts of Korea, the Republic of Korea. I'm often going to say Korea here, but I mean South Korea. Now, at first, during this time period, Syngman Rhee pursued a policy of searching for independence through aid. Basically, he hoped that using aid from outside the country, especially from the United States, would allow him to develop things like heavy industry, that's things like making steel, and electricity. Right? He thought we can use the aid to build this up, and then this will help us to develop later. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but it didn't really work that well. So, and you can kind of see the issues here. In 1956, for example, Korea exported $25 million worth of goods. It imported $389 million worth of goods. That's a pretty bad situation to be in. And my point here is South Korea in the 50s economically is doing terribly. Per capita economic growth was only 2%. That's tiny, right? And it's just, you should be able to get a lot more growth when you have such an underdeveloped economy, right? When you have a very advanced economy, 2% is quite good. But when you have an economy, especially one that's getting the huge amounts of aid it was getting from outside, it should have been much better than this. So South Korea during this time period is not really following economic policies that are going to help it to develop. Rhee does one thing, though, that is, I think, particularly important that he doesn't get enough credit for, though I should also point out this is something that Koreans had long been demanding, was a focus on education. South Korea will focus a lot on developing an educated population. Korea had long, because of its Confucian roots in a sense, had a dedication to education. And so South Korea is going to really push this and develop an increasingly educated workforce. Now, in terms of South Korea's foreign relations, and of course the United States is the most important in these, there are these strong connections with liberal democracies, especially the United States. And there is at times pressure on Syngman Rhee, who there is visiting Koreans in Hawaii. That's why he has all those liaisons. There's this pressure on Rhee to follow democracy, to be someone who takes democracy seriously. he doesn't always do that, as we'll talk about later on. And one reason why there's not more pressure on him is because he's the front line of the Cold War, right? He is in a country that had been invaded by communists. That invasion had been pushed back. There was always a chance they would invade again. And when you've got something like a nation that's been divided like this, it really becomes a kind of competition to see which system is better, right? If things are going better in North Korea than South Korea, then that means that communism is better. If things are going better in South Korea than North Korea, then that means capitalist liberal democracy is better, right? So there's this kind of competition. So this leads to what we sometimes call the tail wagging the dog. As I talked about earlier, the United States could not get Rhee to do what it told him to do a lot of the time. Right, and I gave you that example that where he just released those prisoners of war. We didn't want him to just release them. We were trying to undertake negotiations, but he didn't care. He just released them. He said, "I'm going to do what I'm going to do." And in one sense, we could deal with him somewhat, attempt to get Rhee to do what we wanted because of the foreign aid, especially the fact that we basically paid for almost the entire South Korean military budget during this time period. But he also knew, and he knew that we knew, that there wasn't really a good alternative to Syngman Rhee from the American perspective. So as much as we might get frustrated by him, in the end, we pretty much had to accept him doing what it was he wanted to do. And this is referred to as the tail wagging the dog, right? Instead of the dog wagging the tail, the big part controlling the small part is controlling the big part. And that's one thing you have to keep in mind as you look, if you look at Rhee and the United States-Korean relations during this time period, which I think is very understudied, is this kind of dynamic where we've got a country that's dependent on us in many senses to keep going, especially in terms of its security, and yet we can't get it to do what we want it to do. And like I said, this is where I give Rhee a lot of credit. The guy really was a nationalist and did whatever he thought was best for Korea. Now, also during this time period, Rhee took a very staunchly anti-Japanese stance. Basically, during this time period, Korea had no normal diplomatic relations with Japan. They didn't have any real recognition of the Japanese government. There was no official diplomatic representation in Japan of the Japanese in Korea. Mostly because the Koreans, wanted an apology and reparations for the whole colonial period. This was, of course, frustrating for the United States because we had a military alliance with Japan that was anti-communist. We had a military alliance with Korea that was anti-communist, and we couldn't get them to work together or to even really talk to each other. And what's really bizarre theoretically is that if Japan and Korea were to get in a war, legally we were responsible to help, intervene to help them. So what would we do, right? If two allies get in a war, that's a bizarre situation. So we have this very complex situation in Korea during this time period. Now, what happens is Rhee, over the years, is going to undergo declining support, right? People just are kind of frustrated because things are not getting better. And because his support goes down, but he keeps the same policies, he turns to increasingly authoritarian politics. So, for example, this picture here is of Rhee. There was a certain law he wanted passed, and there was some lawmakers that wanted to vote against his law. So he just had them arrested, and there's the lawmakers who were going to vote against him being put in a bus and taken off to jail. So he turned to these kinds of tactics. He turned increasingly to violence, to cheating at elections, and to doing things like that in order to keep in power. And also, he was getting quite old and seems to have not had the mental capacity he had once had, and so is just not doing a good job leading the country. And this leads to increasing frustration. And this leads to the April 1960 student revolution, where basically students, along with their professors, are going to start protesting against Syngman Rhee. And this protest will spread even further. And the military is not interested in firing on these students of trying to crush the rebellion. The police were willing to act against them, but the military was not. The military, in a country like Korea, the military is often made up of conscripts. Those are soldiers who have been drafted. They are very hesitant to fire on their own people, whereas the police, remember, were often connected to the pro-Japanese forces and were often more political appointees and were more willing to fire on people. But in any case, Syngman Rhee is forced to resign, because of the protests against him. They're so strong and so powerful, and it's very clear that he just can't continue to govern when there's this much unrest. So he resigns and goes into exile in Hawaii, which was a pretty smart thing to do. And I think this is a fascinating thing to look at because, again, I think it's understudied in the United States how Americans are reacting to this. And I even had the library purchase a book, which is a collection of Korean newspaper articles, including the original Korean and English translations that were put out like in May, if I recall correctly, like right after the revolution. And so Koreans were very interested in having Americans understand what had just gone on. And that would make an interesting thing to study. What happened then was the establishment of what's called the Second Republic in 1960, and that is led by Chunghee, who had been in the opposition to Syngman Rhee. Now, one problem with the main problem with the Second Republic was basically because Korea had just had a dictator who did a bad job of governing. The people did not want a dictatorship, so they made a really weak government. And while the government had been united, increasingly in opposition to Rhee, and that had united the opposition parties, once Rhee was out of the picture, the opposition parties started fighting with each other, and you had all this division. And it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain order and stability in society. There was an increase in gangster activity. There was an increase in crime. There was increasing student protests, some of whom were calling for immediate unification with North Korea, which in this time period, North Korea is richer and more powerful than South Korea. So this would basically be South Korea becoming communist is essentially what would happen. And so this government is just doing a really, really poor job. And it's not poor, in a sense, it's not poor Chang Myeon's fault. It's just he doesn't really have a lot of tools because, they've gotten rid of their dictatorship and the government has all these restrictions on it and is just not able to do a lot. So we have all these issues here. And so things are not going well for South Korea. And I think this is a fascinating article, 1961 New York Times, so about this time by A.M. Rosenthal, Outlook Dreary for South Korea. And to quote it, there's a couple fascinating quotes here, I think. South Korea, the poor half of one of the poorest countries in the world, poorer than North Korea, is trying to exist as a nation with too many people and too few resources. The future is of a Korea dependent for the foreseeable future, perhaps for decades, upon the self-interest and charity of the United States. Now, I completely understand what Rosenthal was thinking when he did this. Things did not look good for Korea in 1961. And it's amazing, how Korea has changed, right? South Korea is an extraordinarily wealthy country. And I think it's always an interesting question to say, why were people in the past, how could they be so off about something like this? What was going on in 1960, 61 in this recent history that led someone like Rosenthal to write such an article? And so looking at press coverage during this time of Korea, why is it, what are Americans saying about South Korea? Why are they saying it? Right? That, I think, is an interesting avenue to kind of pursue. Now, what ends up happening, right, the Second Republic does not last very long. And that's because it's going to be overthrown in a military coup. The military was very much disturbed by what was going on. Remember, it's in many ways the most powerful institution, most modern institution in Korea at this time period because, you've got this threat of North Korea. And the soldiers are often very anti-communist and are very concerned that if you have all this chaos going on in South Korea, North Korea might take advantage of it and invade. So the soldiers say, you know what, for the good of the country, for the good of the Korean nation, to protect ourselves from communism, we need to take over. Right? These civilian politicians, they have had a long time to try and fix things, and they're not fixing it. Right? So we need to come in and seize power. And the man who will end up basically being the leader of this is a fellow named Park Chung-hee. Now that's a picture of Park Chung-hee on the right around the time of the coup. The picture on the left, I think, is fascinating because that is Park Chung-hee during World War II. Park Chung-hee would write a letter in blood asking that he be allowed to join the army in Manchuria. Japan had invaded and taken over Manchuria in 1931 and had made it into basically a puppet government. and Japan was in charge of the Manchurian army and training people for the Manchurian army, and Park Chung-hee volunteered to be a part of that army and did serve in that army, giving him a lot of military experience. And remember, the United States and also Syngman Rhee were willing to work with people who'd been pro-Japanese. And Park Chung-hee's complex because he was pro-Korean. He wasn't anti-Korean, but he was also pro-Japanese. So he was a Korean nationalist who was pro-Japanese. And what ends up happening is when Korea gains its independence, he will, of course, join the Korean army. And he's the guy that's going to rise to power. And he wanted to basically make Korea like Japan in the sense of having like a Meiji restoration and making Korea a strong, modern, independent country. Right? That was Park Chung-hee's goals. Now, Park Chung-hee would have loved to have just ruled as a dictator, but the United States pressured him, and he was forced to have an election. And he actually won the election. Park Chung-hee won multiple elections that appear to have been above board, right? To have basically been honest elections. He ended up being popular among some groups of people because his style of authoritarian democracy, he was a president, but he was a president that you had to do what he said, basically. And he wasn't above using violence and terror against his opponents, especially later in his reign, as we'll talk about. But his authoritarian democracy, and I know that sounds like an oxymoron, but that's essentially what it was, is going to bring economic growth, right? And on the right is a symbol that is the Pohang Steelworks, right? Which is this, shows his kind of dedication to the development of heavy industry and making Korea strong, making Korea powerful. Because if you have steel, that's when you can start doing things like building your own cars and so forth. Now, one thing I want to stress is the United States did not like that. We didn't want him to develop a steel industry. We wanted them buying American steel. So Park Chung-hee, like Syngman Rhee, is a Korea first kind of guy, right? He's willing to work with the Americans. He will bow to American pressure when he has no choice. But he is first and foremost looking out for the question of how to make Korea strong. And this is why even today, despite the fact that he was a controversial guy who ended up being assassinated, there are Koreans who support him and look back to his memory, especially the older generation. Younger people not too big of fans of Park Chung-hee. But he is delivering through authoritarian democracy real economic growth. One thing he will do to try and encourage economic growth is, and this goes back to this whole idea of authoritarian democracy, he forces through a treaty of normalization with Japan. And basically what this means is that Japan and the Republic of Korea are going to have a treaty which establishes normal diplomatic relations, right? Basically, they're going to follow international law, they're going to have embassies, and all that stuff. And as part of this treaty normalizing relationships with Japan, Japan agrees to give Korea a certain amount of money, a certain amount of investment, which Park then wants to use to help develop the country. But this is really unpopular, and a lot of students especially oppose this. But Park was able to push it through, and economically speaking, it was a good idea, even though to this day it remains controversial. One relationship, of course, that was also important in the focus of our class is the relationship with the United States. During this time period, the U.S., for one thing, was an example of success. Now, Park Chung-hee and other Koreans often looked to Japan because of its cultural and historical connections, but there was also this understanding, the United States is also a good place to look at. So, for example, Park Chung-hee ordered the building of all this basically an interstate system in imitation of the American interstate system. And people thought he was nuts because they're like, Korea doesn't have that much trade. We don't have much traffic. Why are you building all these roads? But it turned out, and he was correct, that the roads would be used eventually, right? And that by having the infrastructure there, you could have economic development. And the United States often acted as a place where Koreans could go for advanced education, for advanced training, to learn how to use modern and advanced technology. The United States also had military bases there. Bases are often controversial things, especially sometimes if soldiers misbehave. This can cause problems and conflict. But even though some Koreans will criticize having the United States military bases in Korea, the Korean government, it doesn't matter whether they're liberal or conservative, are all on board with it. in not so much today, but in the past, a lot of this had to do with the wealth that this injected into Korea. You've got all these American soldiers spending money, and especially in the 1950s and 60s when Korea was very poor, they were spending relatively a huge amount of money, giving lots of jobs to Koreans, helping with economic development that way. And of course, American military bases are also understood to be a source of security for South Korea, right? If North Korea was to attack, they would certainly run into and kill American soldiers, and that would basically be going to the war against the United States. The United States then could intervene. Now, it's not just military. There's also other international connections. The United States sent huge amounts of aid to South Korea. So to give you an example, from 1946 to 1976, the United States gave $12.6 billion to Korea in aid. That's a bit less than what we gave to all of Latin America, and it's almost twice as much as what we gave to Africa, right? So the United States, because South Korea is on the front line of the Korean War, is giving huge amounts of aid. And that gives us some leverage because if things go bad, if South Korea doesn't do what we like, we can threaten to cut off the aid. But again, that's complex because, of course, if we cut it all off, then South Korea won't do very well. And then North Korea will start looking better than South Korea, or it will hurt South Korea's security. So it's complex, right? But it does give us some leverage. It doesn't give us absolute control, but it does give us some leverage. That we also are a source of technology. And one thing that's particularly important is that we're a source for markets, especially textiles, for example, and wigs and other products that often take high skill but are relatively inexpensive. And this is where the South Korean investment of technology under Syngman Rhee was very beneficial. Or I'm sorry, not technology, education, right? Syngman Rhee and then later Korean governments will focus on education. So you have this disciplined, educated Korean workforce that's often willing to work for very low wages. And the United States, because we're in this Cold War and we want Korea to prosper, we want South Korea to do better than North Korea, we want them to prosper, we're willing to sacrifice our economic interests for political interests. What do I mean by that? We're willing to allow countries like Korea and Japan, we did this as well too, we're allowing them to sell their goods in our markets freely, even if their markets are kept closed to us, and so forth. So South Korea will profit, and this is one reason why, for example, you don't have as many, the mills go out of business in large parts of South Carolina. The mill towns, eventually those factories are going to be closed because it's going to become cheaper to produce those textiles in South Korea. And we're willing to take that hit economically because of our political interest in trying to fight and win the Cold War. One other, so these are all this kind of background information that can help you think about this time period if you want to look at this military relationship with the United States or the aid relationship. One thing especially though about the military relationship is that in the Vietnam War, South Korea sent 300,000 troops. So they were, I believe they were third in terms of number of troops fighting for South Vietnam. Of course, Vietnam was, I believe, the first, then the United States, and finally South Korea. And these Korean troops, the Americans had to foot the bill, and they gained, so this injected a lot of money into South Korea. It also gave their troops experience, right, using modern weapons that they could then use should North Korea try and invade. Also, what's going to happen, and this is something to think about if you're interested, and this is one thing we have to think about, is the Vietnam War and Korea were very closely connected. And that's one thing that I think is kind of understudied. When the United States pulls out of Vietnam, and whenever we want to decrease or remove troops from South Korea, the South Koreans get very nervous, right? Especially, and you can kind of understand this, right? When the United States pulls out of Vietnam and North Vietnam unifies the country in 1975, the communists, win in 1975, that makes the South Koreans very nervous because we just allowed, a divided nation to be unified by the communists, which they say, well, geez, this could happen in South Korea too. But these, I think, are kind of interesting things that you may want to look at in your paper. Now, as I mentioned before, over time, Park Chung-hee is going to become increasingly dictatorial. While people initially support his economic developments, as Korea becomes wealthier, people start saying, well, this is great. Your economic development policies are working. Let's start to have some more freedom. And the factory owners are getting really wealthy, but, in the name of economic development, we've been keeping workers' wages down. We've developed quite a bit. Why don't we let workers get paid more? And Park Chung-hee's response to such criticism in 1972 was basically there's a declaration of a national emergency and the establishment of what's called the Yushin system, which is this constitution that basically gives Park Chung-hee complete power. He becomes basically an absolute dictator. And that's why I chose this image, because this looks like something that you would maybe expect in North Korea, right? That's an audience, like a stage. This is like a military review, and they've got their weapons out. And then they've got a group of people who have made a Park Chung-hee's face with cards. That you have a group of people holding cards, and like there's people holding black cards and blue cards and white cards, and they hold them up to make a picture of him. And what's interesting is Yushin is the Korean pronunciation for a Japanese word, a Chinese word, meaning restoration. And this is what they used in Japan in 1868 when they declared the Meiji Restoration. So it's interesting that he chose those particular words. It shows his kind of pro-Japanese background. But in any case, Park Chung-hee, who already was having this kind of authoritarian democracy, has now just chucked overboard the democracy part and just being a straight-out, flat-out dictator. He may have the name president, but he's just essentially becoming a dictator. And this system will last from about 1972 until his assassination in 1979. There are a lot of protests about this. And a group of people who are uniquely situated to deal with this are religious groups. And religious groups tend to be concerned with human rights. Even in dictatorships, especially if they're anti-communist dictatorships, they can't just go after religion. They have to allow religion to exist. And religious organizations, they're an organization, right, that brings people together. And oftentimes they have international connections, right? So they can get out information about what's going on and they can share it with other people. So you have these religious groups that become very interested in human rights. And in particular, Western, specifically American missionaries, are very active in all of this. So there's a lot of American missionaries who are going to be protesting against the government, helping spread information about what Park Chung-hee's government is doing. I mean, it is torturing people, it's executing people, it's doing a lot of nasty things to people. And these Christian missionaries in Korea are often part of this. And there's an interesting book that is on reserve at the library called More Than Witnesses, and it's a collection of their kind of reminiscences. It's a kind of oral history, and there's also some other works if you're interested in looking at that. And those images there was a group of Korean men who were falsely accused basically of being communist sympathizers, and they were executed. And the picture on the right is of their wives mourning their execution. If I recall correctly, they were found guilty, and then later that day or the next day they were executed. So this was like a total kangaroo court, an example that how Park Chung-hee was really going overboard and just being a straight out dictator. And that was kind of a problem from the perspective of the United States, because we're supposed to be for democracy, but we're also anti-communist and pro-capitalist. And here you've got this anti-communist, pro-capitalist guy, but he's acting in an undemocratic fashion. So how do we deal with that? Right? And looking at these missionaries or looking at coverage in Western newspapers of human rights abuses in South Korea might be an interesting topic. Another area that is understudied that could be interested is what's called Koreagate. And this was an attempt by Park Chung-hee's government to basically bribe American representatives in our Congress to try and get them to follow pro-Korean policies. And this is an interesting book written about this called Gifts of Deceit. And what it's interesting, I think, is how it mentions Sun Myung-moon. He's a leader, the founder of the Unification Church, known pejoratively as the Moonies. And it's interesting that he used his kind of religious power and the money he gained from his church to become engaged in politics. And so this might be kind of an interesting thing to look at. Park Chung-hee was becoming increasingly unpopular, and in 1979, there was increasing unrest. There were all these student and labor protests over his high-handed tactics, over how badly labor had been treated. And students were often at the forefront of any kind of demonstration. So you've got these kinds of problems going on, this kind of chaos that is occurring. And there was a disagreement over what to do about it. And Park Chung-hee really just wanted to call out the army and just suppress these things violently. And the head of the KCIA, which is exactly what it sounds like, it's the Korean CIA, disagreed and actually shot Park during a presidential meeting. And so this is how Park is going to die. And that's how his dictatorship will end, with him being shot to death by one of his own officials. Now, for many Koreans, they were very happy that Park was gone and looked forward to the idea of having a democracy. And there was kind of a temporary government established that was going to try and restore democracy. However, another military man by the name of Chunghee is going to launch a coup and seize power again in 1980. Right, so there was a brief time of democracy in 1979 and into 1980, attempt to form a democratic country, but once again, this will be thwarted by a military coup. Now, there's a city in southwest Korea called Kwangju, which is the kind of the capital of Cholanamdo, which is the South Chola province, and this is an area that had traditionally been in opposition to Park Chung-hee. It's one of the main opposition leaders, Kim Dae-jung, comes from this region, and these people were very anti-Park, and Park punished them by basically preventing their area from developing economically. It was ignored in economic development, and they were very happy when Park had been gotten rid of, and were very upset by Chunghee, and they engaged in some protests, and the government came in very heavy-handed, attacking students who were engaged in protests, and a massive protest movement then broke out, which actually forced the Korean military or the Korean police to retreat. And basically what happened was then the people of Kwangju basically were in charge and ran the city for a few days, calling for democracy, calling for the end of Chunghee. Chunghee, though, responded to these protests by sending in parachute troops, some of the elite troops of the South Korean army, and put this down, killing a large amount of people, killed a very large number of Koreans here. My advisor was teaching English in Kwangju around this time. He happened to be out of the city visiting Seoul when the initial protests broke out, and he wasn't able to get back in until after the massacre. And he talks about seeing all the dead. Lots of Koreans have been killed by the military, and even to this day, it really disturbs him when he talks about this. And one other thing I should point out was that he helped smuggle X-rays that proved that the Korean government had used dum-dum bullets against its own people. And if you're not familiar with what a dum-dum bullet is, you may have seen in a movie how, like, if someone gets shot and then they take out the bullet and the bullet comes out like in one piece. A dum-dum bullet is designed so that when someone gets shot with it, it fragments into little pieces, and therefore does a lot more damage, is harder to remove. And these are actually illegal to use in war, and the Republic of Korea military forces were using them against their own citizens. So this is put down bloodily by Chunghee. Chunghee will then be elected president in a totally rigged election. And there is this very complex question for the United States. How do we respond to this? Right? We've been historically critical of human rights abuses from Park Chung-hee and Syngman Rhee and so forth. And we want to encourage democracy, but the Cold War is going on. And so we also have to be concerned about maintaining our allies who are anti-communist. And of course, Chunghee was anti-communist. And there's always this fear that if we criticize our anti-communist allies too much, that will weaken them and that will give the communists more power, which fundamentally threatens our security. In particular, the United States was fearful of disorder. If South Korea is politically unstable, it looks bad. North Korea, of course, was very politically stable. And remember, in this time period, it's not clear that South Korea has surpassed North Korea. We know now that it has. But in this time period, North Korea really has to be taken seriously. And especially a possible invasion has to be taken seriously, right? There's always this fear that instability in South Korea could lead the North to invade again. And there's this fundamental American problem also. Okay, we don't like this issue of human rights violations, but do we criticize openly and try and force a showdown that could weaken the government we're dealing with and then not even help with human rights? Or do we try and influence quietly? And President Jimmy Carter tended to take the more trying to take the more openly critical approach, made that a big part of his presidency, whereas President Ronald Reagan tended to say, well, let's try and influence things quietly. Now, one thing I have to stress is the Kwangju incident led to massive anti-American feelings in South Korea. And you may say, well, why would that happen, right? I mean, this was a Korean Korean military officer ordering the massacre of Korean people. How's that the Americans' fault? Well, as you can see from this picture, Ronald Reagan is toasting Chun Doo-hwan, right? So rather than harshly criticizing Chun or removing wealth, taking money away from him, taking aid away from him, in the name of quiet influence and anti-communism and national security, the United States just kind of accepts this, right? And many Koreans felt betrayed. We were supposed to be the older brother that would help protect Koreans. We were supposed to be all about democracy. And here we are just accepting this, very just naked power grab and violence directed against these civilians. And one thing I want to stress, this picture I have here is actually in South Korea. You can tell by the background. President Reagan, when he became president, the first foreign leader he welcomed to the United States was Chun Doo-hwan. And typically the Americans would see the Japanese leader, prime minister, before they would meet with the Korean one, before they would meet with the Korean one. In this case, they let the Korean one come in first. So far from criticizing, right, the Chun Doo-hwan for his acts or taking action, instead we welcomed him and in a sense propped up his rule. And it's somewhat erroneous. And so Koreans, that led many Koreans to be anti-American. One kind of misunderstanding they have is they thought that it was us that basically allowed the troops to be sent. And it's actually very complex how this works, and we couldn't really stop the troops from being sent to actually conduct the massacre. However, they do have a point in that the Americans did not criticize Chun and instead welcomed him. And it might make an interesting paper, if you can find the articles, is to look at how anti-Americanism is covered. So one thing that's interesting was that a group of Korean students, for example, in South Korea, basically marched in and occupied the United States Information Services Library, which is like a part of the American embassy, and refused to leave for a while until we engaged in negotiations and convinced them to ultimately leave. But there were other attacks in the 1980s on American structures and property, especially if it's connected directly to the government. American people were generally left alone. And I was in Korea when there was still a significant amount of anti-American influence, and no one ever bothered me as a person. I'd sometimes see signs and there'd be demonstrations, but no one ever was like, oh, there's an American, let's go get him. So it might be interesting to do an article or a paper kind of covering that. Now, here's the thing, though, is despite all that, the Americans did continue pressure on the quiet pressure, but pressure on the Korean government to allow increasing democracy. And this allowed for some opening. There were some reforms that allowed more freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and so forth. And this will allow for the opposition to unite and be active, right? In a sense, the United States is going to put pressure on Chun to have some easing up on civil liberties. That gives room for Korean people to start engaging in anti-government activities and have protests. In 1986, there is a people power revolution in the Philippines, which overthrows Ferdinand Marcos, the longtime dictator of the Philippines the United States had long supported. And we withdrew our support of him in the face of massive popular protests. And I don't think that lesson was lost on the Koreans, that we would, right, if protests were strong enough and big enough, we would withdraw our support of a dictator. Now, a couple things that then are going to happen is Seoul will actually win the bid for the 1988 Olympics. And so this helps encourage more protests, because basically the students and other Koreans, and it's key that it's not just students, workers and middle class people will join them, start saying, look, this is a perfect opportunity, because the president doesn't want to derail the Olympics, right? He wants the Olympics to go smoothly. And we're going to totally mess that up unless he promises to have free elections, right? Now, in these protests in 1987, a student is going to die while being questioned by the government. The government tries to hush that up, and it makes people really, really angry, and they protest even more. And then there's attempts to control the 1988 election. Like what will happen is Chun Doo-hwan will be like, yeah, we'll totally have a free election. Then he says, oh yeah, no, we're not going to have a free election. And that makes people really upset. And eventually what happens is Chun has to agree to a free election in 1988 as the price of getting rid of these popular protests and having a smooth Olympics. Now what will happen is in 1988, there is a free and open presidential election. Chun Doo-hwan's basically successor, his kind of protege, a man named No Tae-woo, will win the election because the opposition will split. But you do have a fair election in 1988. And that's kind of the year I use to kind of end matters when we do have this presidential election. That's the year I like to use as the end, the last year for possible papers. And so you could talk, that would be an interesting paper, look at, how are Americans viewing this? What's American policy? What's going on here? And I think, again, this is often kind of understudied, but that's something to kind of look at. And it's nice to kind of end on something happy, right? We're ending now with an increase in democracy.